Alrighty, welcome to Writing an Interdisciplinary Research Paper Part 3, Nightmare on Gym Street. I'm going to get into the meat of the strategy I think is most effective in trying to write a paper. I know you've heard a lot of different strategies, and hey, you may have one that works for you already. Take some of the issues specific for this class and use them and don't use the rest. But for those who have always had difficulty writing, I offer this as a strategy to employ. Which is why the section is entitled Getting from Outline to Paper. Okay, before we get into some of the substance of the paper, I wanted to at least touch on the issue of a topic for paper number 2. I know a couple of you have raised concerns about this, and it's not something to be concerned about. You should find something that interests you. Writing about something that's interesting to you is a lot easier. Spend some time blue sky researching. Poke around a little bit. See what interests you. Just follow your ideas and see if you can find something that you think you can write about. Once you get into a particular area, try to keep an open mind about the conclusion. The research should lead you to a conclusion. You shouldn't have one before you go in. And plan to meet with me about your paper. It's not a requirement, but you are more than welcome to come and or I guess now Zoom, talk about your paper. And, I'm always a big fan of talking with students about their papers, because the more that I provide feedback on them, the closer it'll be to what I like to see, and the better your grade will be. That's just how things work. Okay, let's talk about how you construct your paper. Before I even develop an outline for a paper, I collect research into appropriate bins or categories. The research can be anything. Blurbs, paragraphs, quotes, cites. One thing you want to be very careful with, however, is documenting where you get those things, because there's nothing worse than finding something awesome for just not having a cite for it and not being able to use it. Be disciplined as you collect those things, and you'll be better off in the long run. So, different kinds of bins would work. Some will be, say, basic science, brain scanning, legal decisions, legal scholarship on Fourth Amendment, whatever it might be. So you just collect anything that you find, papers, decisions, whatever, and you push them into those folders. Then you create an outline and work from within it. And once you have an outline that's informed by the research you've done and the blurbs you've collected and all the little tidbits you've collected, then you can start distributing those tidbits or bins, the content of those bins or categories, throughout the outline to support the points within that part of the outline. When I'm within a paper, I don't try and draft the introduction necessarily or conclusion first. I always try and draft the factual part of the argument or the factual part of the paper, because that shouldn't really be impacted too much about whatever position I'm going to take at the end of the day. The facts are the facts. But also then I develop my arguments right at the same time as I'm doing the facts. The reason I do this is because as I write a paper, sometimes my views change, and something I thought I was going to conclude is in fact something I want to reject concluding now. So any time I would have spent on an intro and conclusion would have been wasted. So I wait until last to do those, or at least after the paper is really taking the form I want it to, and I feel confident in that. How do you get from outline to paper? And it's a big jump, but here are some things that I do. I try and think about the paper as a narrative, and I know this phrase is misused a lot, or overused. Maybe it's not misused, but overused. But really, when it comes to any legal document, it's a narrative. You want to tell a story with that document. Now, the kind of story you tell depends on what you want to accomplish and who your audience is. Here, I'm the audience, and you want to coherently discuss all of the issues within your paper. So the way I try and do that when I first start thinking about a paper is developing an elevator pitch, which is to say something that you're able to convey to an interested person or someone you have trapped in a space for 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. What is your story? What is it that you're working on? What are you concluding? Why are you concluding that? And how can you fit it into a short little bit? Something that's coherent and creates an arc. It tells a compelling story. That elevator pitch can, in that way, match the trajectory of the narrative of your paper. And that narrative should, in turn, shape your outline. Your outline is the narrative in a lot of ways. So when I write, I try and write for at least for this paper, what you should do is write for an educated, interested reader, not an expert. I'm thinking of someone, not someone who knows a bunch of neuroscience like me, perhaps Professor Hepner, who is a generally voracious reader, and if your thesis of your paper is interesting, he'd get on board and read it. And that's the level at which I write. I try and explain things in a deliberate, not rudimentary, but deliberate way, so that an interested reader could follow along. And before I start spending too much time writing, I assess whether I have enough sources to construct an outline and support the thesis that I'm trying to support at the end of the day. Because if, for example, I recognize there's a hole in my research saying, okay, this is one of the points I want to make, that juries have, I want to argue that brain scanning should not be admissible. The brain scan evidence should not be admissible. And one of the points I want to make is that juries, because of the Christmas tree effect, are going to be overly disproportionately affected by those kinds of data, and therefore they fail the test outlined in Federal Rule of Evidence 403. Well, you look at your outline, okay, and you go and look at your jury section, and if you don't have any papers talking about the Christmas tree effect, and you don't have any papers on whether the Christmas tree effect really arises when brain scanning data are presented to a jury, then you still need to do some research. So that's how an outline helps. It emphasizes the points that you're going to argue in the paper and informs your research to see whether or not you have sufficient citations to support the argument that you're going to be making. There's my transitions. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the outline now. So a very basic outline that is applicable to most of the papers that you'll be writing. You can certainly deviate from this. If you're desperate for some structure just to start, this is a good place to go. First is an introduction. It's a brief roadmap for the paper, and it really doesn't try to accomplish a lot more. That's not a terribly long section most times. Then there's a section on explanation of the issue. It's very straightforward. It's just what you would imagine. What is the question you're going to be addressing in the paper, and why is it relevant? Ta-da. If you're taking a position in the papers, for example, that neuroimaging data should not be admissible, then you should explain both sides of that issue. However, you don't have to advocate for both sides. You then say, you conduct an analysis into which side of that issue is more compelling, which are the strengths, facts, and support, courts, commentators, policy reasons that compel you to find that side of the issue more of an appropriate conclusion. You also, at the same time, have to address the shortcomings of the competing arguments. Makes sense, right? It's not enough to say that mine's good. It has to be better. And oftentimes that takes the form of a competing argument being worse. And you have an obligation to raise that if you see it. And this section will be the bulk of your analysis. This is when you'll be talking about, say, cases or science or certain studies that have been done or certain implications of those things. This is where it'll be found. And finally, you have a conclusion. Ties everything together with a nice little bow, conclusion. Let's talk a little bit about how you develop the paper. And this bleeds a little bit into the next section, which is about editing, in the next lecture. But one thing I really can't emphasize strongly enough is to keep working on the outline. It will improve the quality of the arguments and of the paper. Don't be wed to your outline. If it's something that you've put up and spent a lot of time on, you may be at some point wed to that and refuse to restructure it. Feel your way through the paper. If the paper is pushing you, if the topics are such that if you present them in a certain way, it would be much easier to write, don't stick with an outline that doesn't work for you. Keep working on it. It's not sacrosanct. Well, I really like to generate a table of contents as I write. And I do this for a couple of reasons. It's always a pain to go back and recode those, whatever it is, the headings rather, to code the headings for table of contents when you're finished with the document. I just do it along the way. It actually works pretty well. Every once in a while, I like to read that table of contents. And I do that to make sure it still matches my narrative, like in my elevator pitch, this little 2-minute way of explaining my paper, what I'm writing about, and why I'm concluding what I'm concluding. Because if that narrative doesn't match the outline, well, one or the other has to change. You have to take a moment and think about it. Think about the best way of presenting that argument or the best way of explaining that issue. There should be consonance there in any events, and it's important to check along the way that you haven't drifted too far from that. Or if you did it for a good reason. Sometimes as you go through this review of the table of contents or looking at the outline generally, you can discover a section that doesn't fit. It's not a problem to take it out, but don't delete it. Just put it into another file. I call it a tidbits file or whatever you want to call it, whatever. But I just save it, junk file people say, in another document because, look, I spent time working on that. It doesn't suck. I'm going to keep it. Maybe I can use it again in another section or rework it and use it somewhere else. I think that's always a good idea. I'd use that in briefs too, all the time. And like I said, don't be afraid to restructure the paper as you write. It's something where it's really, you gotta essentially listen to the paper, listen to the writing, and recognize when things are becoming strained and can use some restructuring or reordering. I'm shaking my head now. Let's talk a little bit about writing strategy. Again, I superimpose my outline and write within it. That means that there's some messy sections, and as I go through them, I clean them up. But, after I dump the blurbs and bits in there, I have to create a narrative around it, and that helps clean it up tremendously. Here's a general tip. Don't tell the reader what you're going to tell the reader. Just get to it and do it. Nope. Pardon, that was my dog. So, here's an example. In this section, I'll discuss the history of neuroscience. Neuroscience research began by utilizing X-rays, but in the last 2 decades has exploded with the use of functional neuroimaging. Yikes. There's a lot. That's a lot. It's just a lot. So one of the issue that I'm talking about here, though, is cut the first sentence entirely. There's no reason to have that. Don't. It's a waste of space and a word filler. As my transitions are time fillers. There's no reason, in short, to have that type of sentence in every section of your paper, which I have seen in the past. The analysis section of any legal document is key. So let's take a moment and discuss how to improve that section. First, I'd say to try and get some distance and play devil's advocate with yourself. It can be very difficult because typically along the way, you've silenced those criticisms in your paper or brief, whatever it is you're writing. So if you can do it yourself in your own head, or try and do it aloud to a colleague. And the way, of course, that I play devil's advocate in this way is that I take the paper position that's contrary to the position I did in my paper. And after the discussion, see whether you've countered that sufficiently in your paper. Perhaps during the discussion with your colleague, a new aspect of that you hadn't considered previously comes out. That's when you want to take advantage of it to improve the overall rigor of your paper. As you go through and are writing, what I suggest is as soon as something comes into your head that you recognize as missing, go to the section where it's missing, put a bullet down and say insert whatever blank is appropriate here, and then go back to where you were writing. Because those thoughts, particularly when you're in the midst of constructing a section of a paper and generating text, are fleeting. That is something that will stick in your head and you won't be able to remember, figure it out later. So I try and put those things down immediately and jump right back to where I was. It's easier to pick up from the text the thought pattern you had than it is to try and dredge something you can't remember from the depths of your memory. Be kind to yourself when you're writing. Everybody gets writer's block, so don't try and write the perfect sentence. Get the idea down, make it pretty later through editing. First drafts can suck. It's no problem that they do. It's the refinement you do later that'll make it a good paper. Another thing to do, if you have writer's block and can't describe something, write it down, just the idea before bed, look at it first thing in the morning, take a walk, shift what you're working on or a nap. And it is true that when sleeping, there are certain neuroscientific changes that happen in the brain that are believed to underlie different kinds of analytical skills. So it does make sense to sleep on something overnight. And your brain may do some work in the background there, and it may be a lot easier in the bright light of the morning. Oh, dear. Okay. Let's talk briefly about editing and revising, and it'll be the focus of the other lecture more so. But like I said, don't worry about the quality of what you write the first time. It's all editing after the first draft anyway. You want to get the ideas down. Stick with that. It's normal when you're working on really hardcore stuff, like briefs, important briefs, to have 5, 10, 20 drafts of something. You will not have that many. Don't worry. If you have like 5, that's probably a lot. It's cool. Do save it off site or somewhere like Google Drive, something. Make sure you back up. I always get people who lose their papers. I want to make it a year when that doesn't happen for us. Step away from the paper, leave it alone, take a walk, swim, nap, whatever, wait a few days, re-edit at that point, because sometimes you get caught in these little eddies of thinking that make it difficult to really improve the work overall. And look to good law review articles for examples of appropriate writing style, citation, arguing tone, all of those things. If you aren't really sure how to generate that and want to change your ideas in your paper to match that style, the more academic style, more legal scholarship style, then look to those papers that you like, which are good legal scholar papers. I've given you some already in class. You can go to those and take a look.